Hello everybody, this is Bill Reichart with WDR Photography, and this is my very first Photoshop CS3 tutorial. And today we're going to look at adjusting makeup with Photoshop adjustment layers and layer masks so that our adjustments are all non-destructive, which is very important when editing in Photoshop, as I'm sure you know. Today we're going to use a photograph I took of Russian model Tatiana, and you can see some of the pictures of her that I've shot on my website, wdrphotography.com. So here we go, let's get started. The very first thing we're going to do is we're going to zoom in and we're going to look at the color and the iris of the eyes. And we're going to show a real simple, non-destructive way of editing that color. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here to the layer palette, and I'm going to create a new adjustment layer. It is a hue saturation layer. So that will put it, give us a dialog, and we'll put it into the layers palette. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to bump up the saturation so that it looks real crazy so we can see what we're doing. And you'll see that we now have a hue saturation layer in the layers palette. And what we want to do first of all is fill that layer mask with black. So we're going to go fill with black 100%. Now what that does over here is that it tells this hue saturation not to affect anything below it. Anything that's black on the layer mask blocks out the layer, and anything that's white allows the layer to show through to the layers below it. So right now the black layer mask is telling the hue saturation layer not to do anything to the layer below it. So we go back out, and what we want to do now is we want to paint some white into the layer mask. There are a lot of different ways of doing this. These are just kind of the ways that I do it, and I've always tried to be as non-destructive as possible, and you'll see more of what that means as we go through this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the elliptical marquee tool, and we're going to just make a selection that is approximately the size of the iris, tweak it around there a little bit. And then we're going to fill that with white. And we're going to do the same thing for the other iris. Make it about the right size and fill it with white. So what that's doing is that's telling the hue saturation layer, we can see the couple white dots right here, to only adjust the hue saturation to whatever layer is below it where the white dots are. So we go back out, and obviously this doesn't look very good or natural, and so one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to blur the edges. So we're going to go, you can either use Gaussian blur or blur more. We use Gaussian blur at a pretty low blur amount, but it just softens up the edge of that. And now obviously we've got some of the hue saturation affecting the eyelid above it. So we're going to grab the eraser tool, and you can use a paintbrush, you can paint with black. I just have always used the eraser tool. That's our diameter. We don't want a real hard brush, so we're going to stick with that for right now. And then, got my opacity to 40. Make sure your opacity is at 100%. And we're going to go through and we're just going to erase or paint black where that coloring is hitting the eyelids. So now we have a shape for that. That's approximately the actual iris of the eye. And once again, the hue and saturation layer is pumped up really high just so that we can get an idea of what we're doing. Now there's a lot of hair over here, and I don't really want to deal with hair. And since this side of the face is a little shadier, I'm going to take a brush that's really big, And I'm going to take my opacity of my brush back down. And I'm just going to start bumping it out until it looks like, you know, it's somewhat reasonable. Okay, so that's good. You can go in and tweak it just as much as you want. Now what we can do is with this layer mask, or excuse me, this layer, adjustment layer, we can go through and double click it, open it back up, and we can now change this to wherever we want. We can change the saturation, and that starts to look a little bit more natural. And we can turn that off and just see how it's affecting it. We can also change the blending modes to get different effects. Sometimes I'll use overlay if you want a darker effect. Sometimes color dodge will give you kind of a more glass-like effect. And so we can then look at that again. If she wants to have magenta eyes, you can give her magenta eyes or blue or whatever. But we're going to leave her eye color kind of natural. And she has green eyes, so we'll leave them about right there. Then if we back out, you can see it's still a little bit extreme, and you can tweak it further by having this layer adjustment layer be a different opacity. So we can take the opacity down until it starts to look natural. And we'll look at that again a little bit bigger. That's 50% opacity, that's 100%, that's 0. So 50% looks pretty good. So now we can look at this again. And just turn this layer off. This adds just a little bit of glow to the eyes. Now we're going to use the same technique to go in and adjust the whites of the eyes. And once again, there are a lot of different ways of doing this. We're going to add another hue saturation layer, take the saturation down, take the lightness up, and it's adjusting the entire layer because the entire layer mask is white. So what we're going to do again is I'm going to fill that with black. So now that layer is adjusting nothing. And I'm going to take the polygon lasso tool, which is something I use a lot. And then I'm going to go in here and just roughly select the whites of the eyes. And once again, you can be as precise or not precise as you want to be. I'm going to fill that with white, and we can see now that the hue saturation layer is making the whites of the eyes completely white. Do it there. And we're going to move over to this eye and get this little part of it. Fill that with white. So now this is what we have, which looks obviously completely unnatural. So we're going to blur the edges again. I'm just going to use the same filter we used a minute ago. And one of the things you can do, you can again adjust the blending modes, and I generally use screen for this, which is one of the lightning modes. And if we back out again and look, looks pretty horrible. So what we're going to do is I want to take all the saturation out, which I've already done. And we can take the opacity of that layer down. And the idea, really, the way I work with it is just to get it looking pumped up a little bit. But I generally like for things to look pretty as natural as possible. So here we just lightened them up a little bit. Now sometimes it might look a little bit weird because this side of the face is darker than this side, or this eye has a little bit more shadow. So sometimes this side of the eye, or this eye will look correct, and this side will look weird. because it's brightened the same amount. So what we can do is we can paint a gradation across the entire layer mask, and in this case we'll do it from left to right, so that it will tell the adjustment layer to affect this side less than it affects this side. So I've got black as my foreground color. I've got the gradation from the foreground color to transparent. And then I'm just going to drag over this way. And you can see it just darken that just a little bit. You can see it better if we change the opacity back up to 100. So you can see on this side, it's not affecting this eye nearly as much as it is the other side. So take it back down to 19. And if we look at the layer mask, it's a little hard to see here, but you can see that the left side is a little bit darker than the right side. So now we got the eyes, which look pretty good. And what I really want to do, because this has such a strong blue background, I'm going to take and I want to bump up, I want to make her eye makeup kind of go with that background. So we're going to make it a blue color. So I'm going to do the exact same thing as I've done before. I'm going to add a hue saturation mask, tell it to colorize, and we're going to find a nice blue. It kind of goes with the background. Maybe jack up the saturation so we can see what we're doing. And once again, it is adjusting everything below it. So we're going to fill that with black, so it's adjusting nothing. And then we're going to go in, I'm painting on the layer mask again. I'm just going to rough in kind of where blue might be in her eye makeup. And once again, because we're doing this on a layer mask, you can go back at any time and paint to fix what you've done. So now we're going to fill this with white. So now we have a big blue eye, and I'm going to use overlay mode for this. That didn't take. Or you can use color. Use overlay mode just for now. And you'll see how we can fix this later. Now I want to blur this again because obviously this is very jagged, but I want to blur it a lot more than what we've been doing before. So I'm going to jack this way up. So now we have a nice blur across the eye. And you can also tell it just to be excuse me, color mode, which will only affect color, won't affect saturation or luminosity or hue. We can tell it to be multiply, which is a darkening mode, which gives more of a shadowy look. And let's leave that like that for now. And now what's happening here is that we have that layer affecting the center of the eye, which we don't want. So we want to take the eraser tool or the paint tool. We want to either paint or erase black. My brush is too big, so I'm going to get a smaller brush, maybe a little bit of a harder brush, and make sure the opacity is 100%. And we're going to just start erasing away where we really don't want that color to show. And what I'm doing here is I'm clicking and holding down the shift key, which will connect between clicks. So you don't have to really necessarily paint if you're just kind of going along an edge. And so now I've erased that. And this looks kind of weird the way this lower lid is. So what I want to do is I want to blur that part of the layer mask. And we want the strength to be 100%. I'm again going to make it a bigger brush. That's hard. I'm just really going to blur it. If it doesn't work, you can tell it to lighten. Maybe make that brush even larger. Now we can really start to see the effects. Changing it. So we have some blue makeup. It's a little bit strong. So we can adjust, go back to the adjustment layer, and this is where it's non-destructive. We can play with the lightness, play with the saturation. You can even change the color. So if you decided you wanted to go with an entire red motif, you could change it to red right there. And we're going to stick with some blue, a little more saturated. And then if I want to pull that back just a little bit more, just overall, I can change the opacity of that layer. And then you can also use the eraser tool again if you want to really tweak it. Turn it up to a real high diameter, a real soft brush, and then maybe take the opacity down to 20% or so, and then you can just pass by it with a few strokes to really tweak it. So there it is. It's a little bit more dramatic. It fits the image a little bit more, and you could pull in the same thing on this eye if you wanted to a little bit to make it a little more balanced. The next thing we're going to look at is the mouth, and we're going to use the exact same technique for changing the color and saturation of the lips. So we're going to add a hue saturation layer. I'm going to tell it to, I'm not going to colorize this one, but we can see that if we change the color, we're just going to make it crazy so we can see what we're doing. We'll fill the layer mask with black once again. And then I'm going to take the polygon selection tool again and just roughly go around the lips. And I'm going pretty quick at this, so you can tweak it as much as you want. And then we want to fill that part with white. So once again, that's a real hard edge, so we want to blur that edge. Obviously that's going to be too much. And so now we've got her lips colorized, and we're going to go through here again. And obviously green lips aren't working with this image, so we are going to just adjust them, but I do want to get more color into them. You can make them kind of orange, you could do purple, blue. We're going to leave the hue nearly where it was. Maybe make them just a little bit darker. And then if your model's mouth is slightly open like Tatiana's was, you might have one that shows a little bit more teeth, but we're going to go ahead and erase the layer mask where it's crossing her teeth, because it makes a little bit of a difference, as you can see. So I'm just going through and just making a little slot in the layer mask. Okay, so as we go out, it's a little bit extreme. So there are a couple different ways you can do it. You can change it to color mode, where it just adjusts the color. And then you can change the lightness and darkness. You just play around with these sliders till you get it to where you want it. And I'm going to take it just a little bit on the magenta side. You turn that off. It's a real subtle thing, but it can make a big difference. So if we look at overall what we've done, that's where we started, and that's where we are now. And the last thing I'm going to do here is, if I wanted her lips to come off as being a little bit more glossy, we're going to take the background layer. What we're basically going to do is we're going to duplicate the lips, pull out the highlights, and blur them, and then put them in a separate layer as in a screen mode to make them feel like they're glossier. And so what we're going to do is on the background layer, we're just going to roughly select her entire mouth. And I'm going to say copy and paste. And so now we've got a second layer that is just her lips. The layers palette. We're going to pull that layer up to the top. So if we turn off the rest of everything, we just have that. And what I want to do is that I want to adjust the levels so that I'm able to really get some strong highlights, and I can do that a couple different ways. I can do it by just doing levels on the layer, or I can add levels adjustment layer, which is what I'm going to do. So we're just going to put the layer in, and if we change it, it's going to change everything below that layer, which is not what we want. So what you can do is you can tell the layers palette to have that adjustment layer adjust just the layer below it by linking them together. And on Apple, you hold down Option key. I'm on a MacBook Pro. I'm not sure what it is on a PC. I think it's Alt. But when you position the cursor between the two layers and hold down that key, you'll get this icon. And you click, and it tells the layers palette that this levels adjustment only applies to the layer that it's connected to. And that's a real important basic function of the layers palette. So now we can see that the rest of the image is normal, and what we've got here is crazy lips. And what we want to do at this point is we want to really just adjust the contrast through the layers palette so that we have some good highlights on it, which we can start to see down here. Now you could do this as a smart object, but I'm not going to do that at this point. What we want to do here is in the layers palette, once again change the blending mode to screen for this layer, for the lips layer. We zoom out, and so now we can see that we're getting some good highlights on there. And if it's kind of glowing, you probably want to blur a little bit, so we're going to add a Gaussian blur. And this is where you might do it as a smart object, so you could go back and change the blur later if you wanted to, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. So, and what we want to do is go back and adjust the levels again, because it's a little too much of the dark end on it. And I really just want to make the glare show up a little bit more. So now I'm going to add a layer mask to this layer, because what we want to do is paint away the part we don't see. You can just erase it, but I'm going to add a layer mask so I can change the layer later if I want to. So now this layer has a layer mask, and I'm going to use my eraser tool, get in here a little bit, change the diameter. I'm going to keep it a real soft brush. So you got a brush about that big. And then I'm going to take the opacity of that brush down. So then I'm just going to start taking away the edges. Until it starts to look more natural. Obviously, this doesn't look natural at all. So now you can tweak this. I'm doing this a little bit quick, but now we definitely have kind of a more of a glossy look to her lips. And you can tweak it by taking the opacity down of that layer or adjusting anything that we've got in here. We can go back and adjust the levels again if we need to, but we're not going to do that. So that's what we've got, and that's just a real quick way you can go back in any of these layers and adjust what you've got, and that's really what's important in terms of workflow and getting the image done. So thanks for sitting through this. I hope it was a help, and I hope you can use these principles through your images, and we'll see you next time.